Okay, apparently I am live right now, and I guess we don't have a camera on me because with a lot of people out there, I was told that this is a more better way, I guess, to stream or something like that. So hello out there in cyber world. My name's Ed McLaren. I guess I got to introduce myself. I'm sure I know a few of you out here, and I don't. I'm happy that you're all here today. I guess I have about an hour with you. I have roughly 50 minutes or so lecture, and we'll do a little Q&A on the end. And I'm broadcasting today from Park City, Utah. And unfortunately, we have not had any good weather yet this year or any spring-like weather. So hopefully soon. But anyway, to get going here, I was asked to talk about translucent zirconia, but more specifically in the short period of time that I have to focus on really these new sort of gradient zirconia materials. And I'm going to explain what that means. English was hard for me, sorry, in a second here. A couple of wonderful materials on the market that I actually did some of the original research for that I'm going to share with you some very interesting research and how I use these things today, specifically monolithic. And I like to jokingly call it Optimus Prime from Ivoclar or Optimus E Prime. Now, they get very upset because apparently a few people, it created some confusion in the industry. So the material is actually called Prime or Prime Aesthetics, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So if I accidentally say E Prime, I apologize. Remember, the product is named Prime. Many of you know I spent 22 years at UCLA, ran a couple of programs there, then 2 years at the University of Alabama, and then 2 years on crutches because of my hip. But anyway, today what I'm doing is running a little small fun institute, for me anyway, private institute in Park City, Utah. I call it Art Oral America, Art Oral Park City. And I do fun little classes for dentists, technicians, and teams, really focusing on newer technologies, digital dental team. I'll touch a little bit on that a little bit later. You can find me on my website, the courses, if it interests you at all. But anyway, everything I'm going to talk about today, I've actually tested. I built a research lab when I was at UCLA. For the number of years I was there. And then now recently I dumped $250,000 into my own research equipment, Instron, spectrophotometer, and a wear machine, and a few other things that are coming. And that's another reason I don't have a Ferrari, because I've paid for all this stuff. So everything that I mentioned that I will have actually tested. This is thermal cycling equipment. And you might imagine my wife loves all that around the house now, or at least the first floor of the lab. I'm also working on a very interesting book that will be out. I'm almost finished with it now. We're finishing it up right now and get it off to a publisher called Surface. And the reason for this is today what's really happened, which is an exciting thing actually, is monolithic restorations. And the materials we're going to touch on now for monolithic restorations, they've gotten very good. And not quite as good as layering, but a lot easier to use. But the interesting thing about them is still what comes out of a machine isn't finished. It's maybe 80% done. And you've all seen, or most of you have seen anyway, what comes out of a machine. Looks like it still needs some attention. It needs a little contour. It needs a little polish, maybe even glazing or something like that. So the book Surface is dealing with all of those topics, regardless of the materials. I'm going to have chapters on how I finish zirconia, how I finish glass, how I finish the various types of glass, and also composite too. And that's all also turned into courses. I actually run two separate courses. One is in ceramics. I call the Final Touch, where we do what I call the Jim Carrey experience for fun. We machine 2 sets of 6 restorations of different materials, and we go through all the step by step to end up with something finished but done monolithically. So what you see on the right here, and everything in the process from left to right, is monolithic. There's no porcelain. It's just polish. It's just surface color, surface texture to create the illusion and depth of color. And why is that important? The 2 restorations we see on the left of the screen right here, clearly that's what came out of the machine. And if you don't understand some of the firing parameters, which I'm going to share today, you don't understand some of the surface finishing techniques, that's what it ends up looking like when you're done with it. And we've all seen that. That's typically what you get back if you don't touch it up a little bit. These 2 restorations on the right are the exact 2 same files. I machined them from the same place or just a little different place in the puck at the same time. The only thing I did differently was I colored internally. You can color zirconia internally for the dentist out there. I understand we're a little bit over 1,000 people, mostly dentists. a few technicians and some staff and hygienists. So thank you all for coming. But these were all done same thing. There was no porcelain layer in here. This is just understanding how to apply color to the zirconia before you sinter it, completely sinter it, polish it, and glaze it to get really a three-dimensional effect. And just to show you up close, same two files, same two machinings, or two different machinings from the same file, same material, same place in the puck. This is what comes out of the machine. This is no porcelain. Again, there's not even any surface color on this. This is all internal color, sintered, completely sintered, and then just polished. Actually, I didn't even glaze this one. So just with a little bit of understanding how to manipulate these materials, we can significantly improve their final aesthetics. One of the reasons I'm really liking working with zirconia today, now, those of you that know me, I do a lot of porcelain veneers, mostly what I do today. Love doing porcelain veneers, some glass ceramics we'll talk about today. But the interesting benefit to zirconia today is the ability to create custom colors within the same material really easily. So if I have something like Emax, which I've used a lot of Emax over the years, I have to have low translucent, high translucent, medium translucent, and everything in between lucent, okay? With zirconia, and specifically a gradient zirconia, I can have A0, I can have a very bright material, I can have an A2 and maybe an A4, and then with the same puck, the same block of zirconia, I can color it a little bit, I can polish it a little bit like we see on the right, and I can get very different effects from the same material, which is very useful, especially to I'm a small lab today. It's just me and one other person, and then my patients that I see as a dentist. So it really helps me on inventory. And I know companies maybe don't like to hear that. They would love to hear that you buy A1, A0, A3, whatever, every shade in between, but you're still going to use the same amount of material, whether I use a lot of A1 or whether I use a lot of BL3 or something like that, okay? Now, for the courses that I briefly mentioned, the final touch course, when we do the composite course, we actually machine 6 composite, typically TeleoCAD recently from Ivoclar, a very nice material to machine as a composite. We finished those, but during that course, people have asked me how I layer. So we actually layer a tooth start to finish. So I'll show you how to do something like this. Both of these, or all 3 of those, excuse me, are 100% composite. And that's just understanding color, how to mix color a little bit in composite. And I show you how to mix color in composite. And we do this over 2 days plus the 6 front teeth, like I mentioned. And in the porcelain course, I have separate porcelain courses for ceramists that are interested in this, or dentists. Actually, 20 or 30% of the people I have in a porcelain course are dentists because they want to learn how to layer too. So this is 100% porcelain. The previous slide, 100% composite. There is nothing in here but porcelain. Even the calculus and caries is porcelain. And it's not that hard once you understand how to layer. Also, I just developed, and these will be on the market real soon, because I still like to press my glass ceramics. And what I like to do is put my surface texture in my wax. Okay, we machine the wax first, then I texturize it and put this texture in it so that I don't have to grind my surface texture in the finished or pressed or even machined glass. So the purpose is I'd like to have that there. And it's a very simple process if you understand, but there were no really good instruments to put micro texture in wax. So I developed this set of instruments, Pascal Dental, not Pascal Monnier, Pascal Dental will be selling these in the next couple of months, and I'm taking no royalties from this, okay? I know I'm stupid, okay? My wife thinks I'm stupid anyway. All right, well, the topic of hand is talking about translucent zirconia, and more specifically, why a gradient material. Now, I need to define a couple of these things for you because I know you've heard some of these terms, but what does all this really mean, and how does that apply to your daily practice, whether you're a dentist out there and or lab or a combination, both of you working together? So what is all this stuff? We've heard first generation, second, third, fourth, fifth now, hearing all these interesting terms like we heard for bonding agents over the years. And we've heard terms like 3-mole, 4-mole, 5-mole, yttria, 3Y, 4Y, 5Y. So I'm going to try and simplify that for you, okay? Now, if we have any scientists out in the audience there, I apologize. I'm going to oversimplify this, but a basic understanding for the practitioner out there, the general dentist that's making decisions and understand what these terms mean. So you hear all of these materials. What does that mean? And what's a mold anyway? Okay. All right, this might be the best way to explain it. The simplest way to explain it, it's really actually based on carbon. I'm going to leave that alone. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole for a second. But a 3Y material, and you probably heard that. That was the original material like lava, and now you're hearing 5Y. Essentially what it means, 3Y means 3% of the molecules are yttria. Okay, that would mean 97% or something else. In a 5Y material, 5Y materials are 5% of the molecules, so 95% something else. That 95% basically is zirconia. Okay. Now, what happens to the chemistry of the material is that if you have all 3% of the molecules that are yttria, you end up with roughly 100% of tetragonal shape or tetragonal crystal phase zirconia. Now, what that is that the original strong stuff like lava, everybody remembers that name from the beginning of time, or zirconia time anyway, very strong stuff. Glidewell even had an ad where you drove a truck over it that you couldn't break it or something like that. And that was amazing. I mean, it was almost impossible, not impossible, but hard to break that stuff. We did have some problems with porcelain chipping that had all been solved over time. Well, ceramic engineers, that people who know how to work with these materials, knew from the ceramic world that if you increase the amount of yttria, added more yttria oxide to it, it would cause a phase change, a different shape type of zirconia, okay? A cubic phase of zirconia. Cubic phase zirconia, 100% cubic phase zirconia is a fake diamond, okay? So it's very translucent, all right? We don't want a fake diamond for our teeth, but we do want an increased translucency. So at about 5% yttria, we end up with about 50% cubic phase and a much more translucent material. All right, so what's happened since then is everything in between. We've had 4Y, 4.2Y, 3Y, but you're going to hear mostly those terms, 3Y, 4Y, and 5Y, with 4Y being an intermediate amount of cubic phase, which means an intermediate amount of translucency. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Make a discussion in a second how that applies to your understanding of how to use it. Now, most recently, Ivoclar is the first one on the market with the material where they've blended within one material, okay, a multi-layer material, true multi-layer material, where they've created a layer on the surface toward the incisal that is the more translucent, the 5Y, and then in the middle, let's say more dentin color, that's intermediate translucency, the 4Y, and then the 3Y maybe toward the core, okay, that has more opacity, but much more strength. So this is the idea of this. So an optimization of translucency, maybe where you need it on the surface, and then toward the core, toward the connector, an optimization of strength. And so this is a material, the prime material, all right? So then more recently, they came out with a material where they increased the amount of 5Y, okay, the more translucent material, eliminated the 3Y material, and then just have a transition from 4Y to 5Y. Now, this is a more translucent material. So whereas we're going to use something like this, we're going to use it in the anterior part of the mouth. Obviously, I'll show you a bunch of cases in a little bit, but I want you to understand what I'm talking about. And for maybe smaller bridges, because we're going to lose a little bit of strength not having the 3Y in there. And I'm not even sure that we need that in most clinical situations. All right. So that's basically what a gradient material is. All right. Now, so from an optical perspective, so you can understand the real value of this, natural teeth have gradient of color, of course, right? We see that as we look at a natural tooth, but it also has a gradient of translucency. All right, that is the huge optical or aesthetic benefit of this material over a conventional 5Y material. And you've all heard of the 5Y materials like STML, comes to mind right now, HT from Argon. I could think of 5 or 6 or 7 materials, but we'll leave that alone for a second. The benefit here, we look at this tooth on the left. By the way, this was done by Jed Archibald, my partner in crime, and I'll talk a little bit about him as we go through here a little bit. He made this model and made this image for me. All right, we can see tooth number 8 here, that it has a gradient of color, but also a gradient of translucency. We're much more translucent in the incisal third where we want to be. So this is a completely unique material on the market, the only one that originally did this. Now, there's a couple of competitors, like everything else in life, right, that are rushing to the market with similar types of materials. But this is the number one for today. And in Nortaki just came out with something similar fairly recently. a 5Y material you see here again. So let's look at it from a different perspective. From a frontal view, when we just do reflected light, it looks fine. Okay, they both look fine. So we got a 5Y over here. We've got the gradient material over here. They can look very similar in good light. The issue is when you change the light pattern, when you go into a shadow, when you got a unidirectional light maybe coming from the side, if you don't have a gradient of translucency, I don't know if you can all see my pointer. I'm moving my pointer around the screen. Hopefully you can see it. If you don't have a gradient of translucency in your restoration, the difference between a natural tooth and your restoration will jump off the page at you. And you all remember that from metal ceramic days, right? A metal ceramic crown, you look at it, look maybe very good, but you change the light, you change the angle, and all of a sudden it'll pacify. That is what happens with a mono translucent material much more often, okay? So that's the real benefit of this material. So it truly is a multi-gradient material. When you hear these other materials, they're really multicolor. They're not multi-gradient. They don't have different layers of material. Now, here is one of the biggest issues that I would be concerned about when I put my material scientist hat on, because I do some science, is one of the things we want to make sure is, since there's slightly different amounts of different types of crystals in there, they could have slightly different expansion, contractions, things like that, is that when you fire it, does it warp at all? All right, so prime, this again, Jed Archibald did this research here, and we're working on more stuff like this. We're designing something, the shape of a basically horseshoe bridge, really, as we speak, so we can test this a little further. Prime and the only other competitor on the market, what we see happening is that we get some warpage. Okay, so where's that critical? So this is the other material on the market. I don't want to get anybody in trouble or stuff like that. Beautiful material, but I would be very concerned, not for a single unit, okay? A bridge. All right, so for a bridge, that would be a very concerning issue, because you can see there's at least 3 to 5% warpage of this bar from this. And so until further notice, if you want to, I would strongly recommend that if you want to move into this space and you're not doing this type of material, this is what I would use for a bridge for sure. Probably either of the materials is fine for a single restoration. All right, so what is all of this discussion about transformation toughening? I want to share with you why there's still a benefit to have either a 3Y or a 4Y in material. Some of you probably heard this term, and maybe this is new for some of you out there, a term in ceramic engineering called transformation toughening. And zirconia, specifically tetragonal zirconia, that shaped crystal, the one on the left of the screen right here, when you apply an external energy source to it, grinding on it, sandblasting it, even potentially chewing on it, okay, it will undergo a phase transformation from this shaped crystal to this shaped crystal, okay, a slightly bigger crystal, a monoclinic crystal. So that's another form of zirconia. Okay, why is that a benefit? Okay, because when that happens, if you, let me go forward to this slide right here. Let's say you have a micro crack in the neighborhood of microns, just a few microns, okay? An energy source is applied to these crystals, well, crystal circles here in this diagram we made, okay? They will grow, that will change shape, and it will close this space off. So you actually get a crack healing, not complete crack healing, but a compression around a small crack space, okay? What's interesting is a pure cubic material won't do that. So when you have a small crack in a material or something that you've started by grinding on it or something like that, it will not undergo a change of shape, the cubic material. Now, I'm going to show with you in a second what that does to the strength in a little bit. So this is why we want, certainly for a bridge, or maybe a second molar, first molar, things where there's high stresses, deep in our restoration, we want some 4Y material, at least some 4Y material, because both of these materials will transform. So what that means is it won't lose strength with processing, okay? All right, let's go forward. You already saw that slide. All right, this is the real reason why a gradient is best, because I can have this, along with the aesthetics, excuse me, I've already mentioned, I can have this material deeper in the restoration, the 4Y material. I can have the 4Y or 3Y in a connector area, which is going to concentrate stress. And then I can have the more translucent 5Y material on the surface. All right, let's talk about relevant research. I've done and published about 4 papers now on this stuff, and there's a whole bunch of stuff coming out here in laboratory-based stuff, and I'm going to share with you some of the laboratory data. But interestingly, I have not been able to find any clinical research yet. any decent clinical research. I've seen some case reports. Somebody said they did 10 restorations or 20 or 30 or 40 or whatever, and one broke or none broke or something like that. So we have not seen any good clinical data yet, which is obviously potentially a little bit scary. But I would like to share with you some of this in vitro data we did and why this is important for you to understand, okay? We published on this a few years ago. I put it in a very simple place so people could get to it fast, a compendium. And then more recently, we published in the Journal of Prosthetic Dentistry. You can find all this stuff on my website and download the article. So first thing we wanted to do is the sort of standard test and see, how strong these materials are and how they compared with other materials. But more importantly, or just as importantly, let's say, is how they behaved if we stressed them, if we ground on them, if we did different sorts of surface treatments, because there's a lot of people out there that are recommending sandblasting, me too, in some areas, potentially grinding on it, says it doesn't matter at all what you do to the surface of zirconia. So let me share with you this simple data. Now, maybe not so simple for me now, I guess, okay, because I've done it a few hundred times, it seems like. The red bars are the original 3Y materials. There was a 3Y material with a little alumina in it and a 3Y without any alumina in it. I won't go to there why there was a little alumina. The blue bars are the 5Y materials that were on the market. We tested this 2015, 2016 when it first came out. Now let's look at this Argon Z, pretty good, 800 megapascals. A couple things over here, maybe not so good. Some of these companies want to kill me for this, but this was the data. And we redid it a couple of times and it came pretty close. That's the strength polished. Okay, none of us polish our restorations perfectly smooth. Most of us sandblast them a little bit. Here's what happens when you sandblast zirconia. And this was what was exciting about the 3Y materials, the original 3Y materials, the lavas, those types of materials, that if you sandblasted them, this is like lava, it actually got stronger because of that transformation phenomena, that crack sealing phenomena, okay? This was the 3Y material with alumina. This was without alumina. The one without alumina, like Bruxer, didn't get weaker at all. So we could grind on it, we could sandblast it, we could do whatever we want to, and that wasn't a problem. I suppose if we hit it with a hammer, that would be a problem. All right, but when we take any 5Y material, and this is important to understand, any 5Y material, when you sandblast it, when you take aluminous oxide on the inside, in our bar dimensions, this got about 50% weaker. We lost about 50% of the strength of all of these materials. The ones that were already a little bit weaker to start with, these types of materials over here didn't lose as much strength. But the ones up here, 900 megapascals, they were down around 250, 300 megapascals. By the way, according to the ADA, to do a posterior crown, you need approximately 400 megapascals flexural strength for posterior crown. And I believe it's 800 for an anterior bridge, or 600 for an anterior bridge and 800 for a posterior bridge, according to recommendations. All right. So what you can see here is that when we sandblast this stuff, we are below the ADA recommendations for crowns, for posterior crowns anyway. All right, now I got cremated for that. I was afraid that I would start my car one day and it would literally blow up, like in the movie Casino and De Niro. Because, I'm not a pure scientist, I'm not a PhD, I'm not this, I'm not that. And then the other thing, the discussion that came up was that everybody's doing discs now. Instead of bars, we do discs. So we went ahead and did a bunch of discs, and this got published too. And we broke the disc. There's a scientific reason why you might want to do a disc over a bar. And I did this with one of my graduate students who is now in tenure track at University of Iowa, and Vita Maharishi. She's been in a couple of my movies as Rey Vita, sort of a Star Wars character. Anyway, and she's got a couple of masters, working on a PhD and a few fun things like that. So we did all this stuff. We made up, it was 400 or 500 discs. And we tested a bunch of different things because we wanted to see if we could recreate in disc what we saw in bars, but then we also wanted to look at surface treatments too. All right, so I was not able to get a lot of the companies to redo discs for me because they were mad. All right, but thankfully some of the better companies like Argon, like Ivoclar, like Noritake were very helpful. 3M, when I think they took theirs off the market, were very helpful. So interestingly, what we're looking at, the very first bar is a disc. that was polished perfectly smooth. Like you would do in science, you want to have a theoretical strength. We got around 750 megapascals, which is what they advertise. And this was the first 4Y material. It's called Emax Zircad MT on the market. We get up over 900 megapascals, which is fine for a bridge. All right. Then that was polished. Now, none of us cement polished restorations. We machine them and we cement them. So I thought it'd be very interesting to look at as machined. What was the strength of the material after it came out of the machine? Because it's not perfectly smooth. All of them drop down to right around 600 megapascals. So your true strength of these materials is right around 600. Okay, probably okay for an anterior bridge, but not a posterior bridge. All right, then we did sandblasting again, aluminous oxide. That's column 3. We dropped down not half from the 750, but we were down right around 450, 475. So you still see about a 40% drop off in strength. Why? Because little microscopic defects are created on the surface that can concentrate stress when you chew on it or bend it or do whatever you do to it, that eventually leads to failure, just like a glass. Now, what was interesting, the 4Y material actually got a little stronger. So we got a little bit stronger with the 4Y material, which tells us then that that was probably a phase transformation very similar to a 3Y material. All right. So that was the first one on the market. We'll talk about some other ones in a minute. All right. So what came up with that is, okay, if we're not going to sandblast it, one of the reasons we want to use this is for conventional cementation. So what if we want to conventionally cement these things? Okay, great. Wanted to look at different surface treatments. So like Emax, if you look at the Emax or most companies, what they recommend for their glass ceramics today is not to use aluminous oxide. They recommend using glass particles or glass beads. So we looked at that. We did all 4 groups again with glass beads. And here's what we saw. The strength did not drop off from as machined. And I'm going to tell you this about 3 times now. So here's here's an inflection point that you want to know. One of the main points of this lecture, that if you're going to conventionally cement a 5Y material, okay, several on the market, you need to know that about your material. You do not want to sandblast it. You want to tell your lab to clean it with glass beads for conventional cementation. What's conventional cementation? Zinc phosphate, if you still do it. Number 2, glass ionomer. Number 3, resin reinforced glass ionomer, basically conventional cementation. Okay. Now this didn't change in strength much here. We'll come back to that in just a second. All right. Now, what if you want to bond it though? The research shows that if you want to bond it, you do have to sandblast it. So we looked at that too. Okay. So what we did is we took some discs, we sandblasted them, and we put an MDP primer on them. The special ceramic primer, big 10 phosphate number or something that could, I used to remember all this stuff. Okay, and then we just used a conventional dual cure cement. And what we got was the strength came back up from like the 450 almost up to 600. So here's going to be the thing. You need to decide, am I going to bond? Simple question, bond or cement? Bond or cement? Cement, glass beads, bond, aluminous oxide, and then you're going to use a primer. I'm going to recommend why you're going to use a primer here in a little bit. So 2 surface treatments based on the cementation technique, okay? And that's all been published. It's been published in the IEDR, it's coming out in the JPD, and it is in the JPD, and some other stuff on JPD coming out soon that we did looking at this new material. So I was very interested in looking at the prime, or the Optimus Prime, as I like to jokingly call it. Kind of like those movies, the Transformers. My kids did anyway. All right, so we looked at the 3 different layers. I wanted to know, do these layers really behave like the 3Y, 4Y, 5Y material? So we made some discs of the 3Y. We're 1,200 megapascals. The 4Y material, 1,100 megapascals, over 1,100, and the top, the 5Y, around 800, actually a little more than 750. And then column 2 was as machined. So the as machine, what happens is just machining. So we lose a little bit of strength just for machining, okay? Now, when we sandblasted them, aluminous oxide, the strength comes back up to baseline. So this clearly is transformation toughening. Also, too, we get a little increase in strength from as machined right here on the 4Y. So this is plenty strong enough for a bridge. And we still have way better translucency than this stuff over here. Now, clearly you can see the 5Y material drop down a little bit lower, but we're not going to sandblast the 5Y material. The 5Y is on the surface. This is sandblasting on the inside. On the outside, it doesn't matter what you do because ceramics fail from the inside out. Okay, it fails from the cementation surface to the outer surface. And that's the surface we need to protect here and make sure we have maybe one of the stronger materials or we've bonded it. Okay, so recently we just looked at the E-prime or prime aesthetics. I apologize, prime aesthetics. Okay, we looked at it polished, the 4Y layer. Remember, that's a 4 and a 5Y material. We had right around 1100 megapascals on the 4Y. And then 784, 750 is to round up, or 800 to round down, or the other direction, excuse me. It's dyslexic as a child. It's coming out now, it sounds like. Okay, so second group was just sandblasted. I want to see what it looked like sandblasted. We did get a little drop in strength, which was interesting, okay, but not much for the 4Y material, and some drop in strength which is expected for a 5Y material. So this is behaving very well. So for me, this is the most aesthetic material of the two. The other one's good, but this is great. All right, that my design, I'm going to have this stronger stuff when you nest it, okay, more toward the inner surface of the core connector. And this is just going to be how I would design. This is more on the surface. And let's talk about the translucency now of those materials. Okay, so you got the science, and hopefully that wasn't too much. But I want you to understand that when you're buying a material, when you're looking at a material, you need to know the quantity of yttria in the material and understand where to place the stronger and the more translucent material, so you take advantage of the two basic properties, the increase in strength of the 3 or 4Y material and the increase in translucency of the 5Y. And so another one of my fun machines, I bought a $27,000 toy. It's off my right shoulder over here to test translucency. Now, here's an interesting thing about a translucency I want to share with you. You're going to see a lot of people report numbers 50, 60, 70% translucency, okay? That a lot of the stuff that's out there, and we all know it's BS, bad science, okay? The scientists that I know, the pure scientists, when I share information and we design the things that we design, we want to work with practical thicknesses. I want you to look, when you see a translucency study, check and see what the specimen thickness is. If I make a specimen 0.5 of a millimeter, 0.2 of a millimeter, it's going to be really translucent. How many of you work with 0.2 of a millimeter crowns? I don't. Okay, so typically we're in a 1 millimeter thickness. So I'm going to share with you 1 millimeter thickness, and the very reputable people work in 1 millimeter thicknesses. Because if I showed you 0.5 millimeter, this would go up 50%. Okay, so these are all 1 millimeter thicknesses. Looking at some of the materials on the market, this is one of the more translucent materials, all right, on the market. Okay, these are both A2. Now we all know that, like with composites, an A2 is not an A2, not an A2. It's the same thing with zirconia. All right, this is one of the more translucent materials, so very nice translucency. This is Ivoclar's 4Y material, which was one of my favorite materials till the newer material came out. But I just wanted to show you the translucency differences and the color differences between the three layers: the internal layer, the 3Y layer, the 4Y layer, and the 5Y layer. So this is actually decent translucency, believe it or not, for a 3Y material. All right, so again, we're getting that gradient of translucency like a natural tooth. So just recently I tested Prime Aesthetics with YML that just came on the market. These are both A2 shades, and you can see they look fairly similar, with the Ivoclar being just a little bit more translucent and a little bit less chromatic. And like I said, the reason for choosing this today for me for a bridge for sure would be the fact that it's very stable. It doesn't warp, okay? So both of them have excellent aesthetics. Now, the other interesting thing you can do with these materials is you can alter your translucency on how you fire them. Please take a picture of the screen. I don't mind if you copy or anything, the screens and stuff like this. This is some work that Jed did, Archibald. I stick with the longer numbers here because I just see that it gets a little better translucency, okay? And maybe I don't have the best oven on the market. When you've got these really good ovens like the Ivoclar oven, maybe I can get them to give me one, because the Ivoclar people are listening out there. So that, especially if you have a little bit of an older oven, okay, maybe not quite, let's say, as well temperature controlled, you want to go with the little longer firing temperatures here. Now, what I was about to say, and I cut myself off, is Jed's come up with a way to alter the translucency by holding at different firing temperatures, all right? So you can get a little bit more lower translucency. It's 1500. a little bit higher translucency at 1600 degrees Celsius. So you want to make sure if you're getting a new oven today in your ovens, and you're not happy with your oven, get one that you can get the temperature up to 1600 degrees. So that's what I do for my more translucent, which is typically anterior teeth. So for anterior teeth, I'm firing at the 1600 temperature. Maybe for a molar, I'm somewhere in between 1525, 1550 with these longer firing schedules that you see here. And it's important that you maintain these, because one of the main reasons for really ugly zirconia is poor firing. Remember those first couple of samples that I showed you how bad a couple of them were? It was firing with old ovens. I wasn't intentionally trying to screw it up, but if you don't have a really good oven that holds good temperature, good calibrated temperature, and controlled rise and controlled cooling, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with something very opaque. It'll look like a marble. And that's why I don't like speed firing, by the way. Speed firing generally ends up a little bit too opaque for me for an anterior restoration. All right, so where do you use these things? Okay, so what's the indications? All right, we talked about the numbers for bridges. We want to be over 800 megapascals for a bridge. So for a bridge, you're going to want to use a 4Y material or something like Prime. It's just a pure 4Y like Zircad MT or a couple of other on the market that are good materials. But ideally, I'm going to want to use a gradient material that has the 4Y and 3Y maybe deep in the connector that I could put a little thin layer of porcelain on or something like that if I want to. Or I could just have it a little more monolithic if I want to. I like to, on the anterior teeth, layer a little bit of porcelain, and I don't layer it all in the posterior. Now, having said that, I've experimented. I think I made 8 single centrals now, as I remember, about 8, to see if I could match a single central with these materials. And you can see that this is a reasonable match, not a perfect match, but a reasonable match. So where do we use our 5Y or our prime aesthetic materials, not E prime, but prime aesthetic for single units, maybe an anterior bridge for the prime aesthetic material. And in a situation that understanding we fire it correctly, and yes, there is a little surface paint on here, but that's a very nice result. And so this is what I'm talking about. We can get this kind of result. I already showed you this slide earlier, completely a 3-dimensional color, a 3-dimensional translucency, but without layering. And that's it's not dead, but it's a dying skill set. And I'm fighting hard to try and keep that alive, but you know, the world is the world, okay? All right, now, what about a polychromatic tooth? People would always say, well, wait a minute, now if I've got multiple colors in my base, my prep, my stump, or whatever we want to call that, and I got a polychromatic tooth, it's not so easy to do. So I attempted 2 restorations. Here's the first one I tried, okay? And he liked it, the patient liked it. I didn't like it. I didn't think I did a great color match, so I remade that. This is 100% prime aesthetics with no porcelain. So is it perfect? Is it exactly the same as if I could layer? No, but it fooled the eye. The patient couldn't tell. I was teaching with this. Nobody else could tell, at least at conversational distance. And that's what we're trying to do, fool people at conversational distance. This is dental Disneyland, everybody. We all know that when we get up this close and try and fool our friends and fool Mother Nature, we're doing that for our Disneyland trip, so to speak. Okay, now let's move in to talk about cementation. Got a few minutes to go here, and then we'll finish up with questions. What about cementation? All right. Should we do adhesion? Should we do cement? I like to use conventional cement if I can. All right. So that's one of the reasons I want a 4Y material, at least toward the tooth. So if I've got retention and resistance form, I'm going to use a conventional cement, and especially a crown preparation, right? If I'm doing something less retentive in my preparation, I want to be able to adhere it. So what you should do depends, one, on the material, but also your cementation technique. I've already told you once, I'm going to tell you again. Now, if you're working with a 4Y material, you can do anything you want. You can sandblast it, you can beat it up, you can grind on it, you could drive a truck over it, maybe not, okay? But a 5Y material, you need to remember your cementation technique. So you're going to choose the internal surface treatment based on your cementation technique. And to quickly review, conventional cement, glass beads, okay, adhesion, bonding, aluminous oxide, all right? So this is basically what I just said. So I'm going to do glass beads on the internal surface of a 5Y for conventional cementation. If I'm going to bond a 4Y or a 5Y material, we're going to do aluminous oxide. sandblasting, basically. That's another way for it. Okay, why? Okay, so we create a little bit of roughness. What it does is create a little bit of roughness, and that helps with macromechanical retention and the adhesion of the cement. Now, what do you do toward the tooth? Whatever you would normally do adhesive toward the tooth. I like to use the universal adhesives and what I call fourth generation 2.0, okay, where I use the universal adhesive as my primer, and then I use the filled adhesive on top of it as a wetting agent. It takes me 30 extra seconds, but I can show you that gives you the best bond strength. All right. Now, why do you want to sandblast? John Burgess, I'm part of a couple of famous FL et al's, one of my mentors at University of Alabama. I spent a couple of years there. He's one of people with many of the Marcus Blantzes, the Matthias Kerns, that shows that you get an increased surface roughness, which is fine for 3 or 4 wide, doesn't affect the strength, which gives you a 30% better bond strength minimum, roughly, okay, on top of your chemical adhesion. We also looked at that too and published it about 10 years ago now, okay, looking at different sort of surface treatments. But here was what was interesting that came up about this, okay? You can look this paper up if you want. The most interesting point to me was that if you did not put a primer on, you did not wet the surface of the zirconia first with a primer, whether you use a self-adhesive primer or not, you didn't get as good long-term bond strength. Initially, you got very good bond strength, okay? But when you fatigued it or thermocycled it over time, it went down to almost zero, Panavia here and Multilink without a primer. So when you add a primer to it, when you use Panavia with a primer, the low viscosity primer, Mono Bond Plus, I use Z Prime Plus from Bisco, I'll show you in just a second, is my primer. The bond strength stayed relatively high even after thermal cycling. Now, I know Marcus Blantz, if you read a recent paper, showed that with the V5, you don't need it. I'd be a little concerned about that because I can show you that it doesn't wet very well. Bonding is a wetting phenomena. It has to wet the surface. No matter how good your glue is, if it doesn't touch the surface, it won't wet. So please just add a low viscosity, the special zirconia primer before you put the cement on. It takes 10 seconds, 20 seconds. All right, so we looked at this too, and we published this somewhere a long time ago, 10 minutes, 24 hours, and 2 weeks. And this is the reason why I use the Z Prime Plus. It was pretty consistent over time, 10 minutes, 24 hours, and 2 weeks, the Z Prime Plus with a cement, with a dual cure cement. And you don't have to have any special cement, just a normal dual cure cement then. Okay. All right. Now, there's a lot of been discussion about universal primers. We did this too. So universal primer, like Scotch Bond Universal, All Bond Universal, and there's about 10 other ones on the market now. And they say that they universally stick to everything. They stick to Teflon, they stick to everything. You just need it by itself. You don't need anything else. Okay, so here's an interesting thing that we found, and we tested this with Scotch Bond, but also with All Bond. We actually got a significantly better strength if we pre-cured it. Meaning, they say you can paint it on the zirconia surface, don't need to cure it, then put your cement on and cure everything at once. When we did that, our bond strength was around 11 megapascals. That's not bad. Zinc phosphate, we'd get 1, okay? But if we want true adhesion, we want to get closer to 20 megapascals. It was much better to pre-cure the adhesive to the zirconia. Now, if you're going to do that set up a red flag or a yellow flag in many of your mind right now. If I'm going to cure toward the zirconia, I better make sure that stuff doesn't pool anywhere. Thankfully, it's very thin on its own, but when you put it on, you want to wipe off the excess. You're going to evaporate the solvent, wipe off the excess, then cure it. And when we did that, we got around 10, 12 microns for the thickness. If you just put it on the surface and cure it, you're going to get 20, 25, 30 microns, which then might mean your crown doesn't seed. All right. So that would be okay to use. My preference is not to use the universal. Okay, for my bonding agent to zirconia, I just use the Z Prime Plus or Monobond Plus, one of the materials specifically for that. Now, the last question that comes up relative to this, do we really get a bond like we would think of with etched porcelain? So one of the things that's always talked about in medicine, and we talk about it in dentistry too, is clinical studies. But more important than a clinical study, at the highest level of our evidence hierarchy, is what's called a meta-analysis, where it looks at lots of studies and reports on lots of studies. So this was using an MDP type primers, sandblasting, and looking at single wings or inlay bridges and stuff like this by Matthias Kern, who's one of the leaders in the world. He had 0 debonding at 10 years. Okay, so it worked, but look at everybody else. So if you're not Matthias Kern and you're sandblasting and you're using a primer, so this was 7%, you might say 7% is high, but at 5 years, that's pretty high. That's almost 2% per year. Look at this guy at 12 months. Sorry, man. Don't want to go to him to have bonding anyway, maybe anything else. 46% failure rate at 12 months, 4.3 at 2 years. So this is a very high failure rate. I mean, I don't know about you, but I want to be well less than 1% per year. Imagine if 5% of your restorations failed every year and you did 1,000, you got 51 year failing, the next year 50 plus 50 and 50 plus every year after that. Okay. So I'm suggesting that we're not getting adhesion exactly like etched porcelain. Initially, we get very high numbers. So what does that mean for your prep? And I only can do so much in one day. I want to make you aware of this material. If I'm doing an onlay preparation, I'm putting maybe a little retention groove in there, going back to maybe a little gold thought process, okay? Where I have a little retention groove, so I have a little lateral stability to give a little bit more retention and resistance for them. All right. Now, here's something that's very interesting that I played around with. I have not done it clinically yet. I did test it a little bit. My colleagues at UCLA, there is one product that will etch a 5Y material quite well. It's called Zirconia E-Etch. You can look it up on their website right here. Now, the interesting thing about this, you have to have special laboratory equipment because this is very caustic acid. Look at all these acids in here, all right? And you have to have gloves on. You have to have an evacuation system to be able to use it. But it does etch. It does create a very nice etch pattern on the surface of a 5Y material. It didn't on a 3Y material, though. So 3Y is a different material. So 5Y, so essentially what it's etching is the cubic phase, okay? It's roughening the cubic phase, not the tetragonal phase. So the 4Y somewhere in between, we looked at that too. So that would be the one material that would give you a true etch pattern. Now we're looking at another material. Jed and I are looking at the ability to etch the ceramic before we sinter it. So I don't have any final data on that, so I don't want to say anything. It would be really easy to do. You just paint it on the inside of the restoration. It roughens it a little bit, okay? And then you sinter it. So you already got a rough surface. So we're looking at that as we speak. So that might be something that we can recommend in the very, very short near future. And I'll report on that. I have a whole bunch of articles. I can't get into all the steps on how I go from the left of the screen to the right of the screen. Please go to my webpage, edmclaren.com. And of the 98 articles I've written now, I got about 60 of them there. And there's 4 or 5 of them on optimizing the step by step of how you optimize translucent zirconia, how you go from left to right here. All right, and the last thing I want to say is we'll take some questions here. Oh, forgot I dropped one more case in, okay? Now, I test different materials on the same patient. So you can see that this prime aesthetics, not E prime, prime aesthetics, actually just as good as any 5Y on the market. And this is a 5Y, and I got this is my professional patient friend that owed me some money, and let me do 4 different types of materials on him. Okay, and this is the last thing I want to say. One of the exciting things that we're experimenting with materials, can we make veneers with these? Now, this isn't a universal recommendation, but I just wanted to show you a case we made in a course with the prime aesthetics. Now, that's not like glass. I get it. It's not quite as translucent as glass, but I'm not worried about this chipping or breaking at all, okay? So potentially an alternative for veneers. My personal choice still today, okay, is what I like to call the digital dental team. I like machine glass. And my favorite glass, believe it or not, is something you haven't heard in a while, Empress Multi. Empress Multi. Please ask the Ivoclar company. They still sell it. I think that's the best machinable glass on the market, along with Vita. The Vita blocks are good too. So they're both real good, okay? So Empress Multi, it's got a gradient of color, and this is 100% monolithic with a little bit of blue paint right there. I don't think you can tell the difference between this and a porcelain veneer. And I'm not worried about this fracturing. So this has a little bit more translucency, a little bit more natural. I'd like to take a second and thank, I like to call him the digital MacGyver, Jed Archibald, who used to do for like 20 years, did all of the specimens for Gordon Christensen and Rella Christensen of CRA, now CR, specifically with zirconia and all the testing that they did. And he's become one of my best friends, but also he collaborates and does everything and helps me design all this stuff, tells me what I'm doing wrong, which is usually a lot, by the way. There is his contact information. If anybody's looking for a good digital lab, or an artist too, but also problem solving, he comes into laboratories and then helps them with their digital issue. He's a 3D printing expert. He's calibrated all of my stuff literally on a daily basis. So you can contact him separately. And obviously he takes on dentist accounts too. All right, so that's great. That brings me to the end, right, at 50 minutes, which they told me to keep it at 50 minutes. That gives a few minutes for Q&A. So why don't I turn on the Q&A? Okay. All right. That was thanks, Tracy. Wow. Okay. That was fantastic. So creative. Don't think I have to answer that. You say to wipe off the excess bond. Yes, is air drying not enough? Okay, so when you air dry, okay, you're probably going to get most of it. You need to do that anyway, right? Because you have to evaporate the solvent. They put a solvent in universals. Typically, it's ethanol and water, and you want to get that out because then it won't bond to the next layer and it won't cure quite as well. I would still, here's what I do, very simple, okay? All I do is I take a nylon brush, little micro brush, after I evaporate the solvent, thin the layer, and then I just wipe in the line angles. So just take a couple dry brushes and wipe around the line angles. And then when you do that, we looked at that, we're down around 8-10 microns, okay? Cured, okay? So that's great, okay? That never affected seeding. 8 to 10 microns. And when you're 30-40 microns, you potentially could create a problem. So that's how I would do it again. So sorry, I thought the camera was on. It's not. I'm using very wonderful hand gestures here. Is air for 10 seconds. Okay, that'll evaporate the solvent. That'll thin it. Then a dry nylon brush, wipe the line angles. Okay. All right. Thanks, Kevin. Okay. He had a nice comment. Said that was very excellent. Best one I've taken in a long time. Okay. Take more then. I appreciate that. Any other questions out there? I only see 3 questions. Here comes a couple more. Can I sign up on the list for your new book? Just follow me on social media. You'll see it when it comes out. Initially, believe it or not, Quintessence didn't want to do it. I don't know why. They didn't think it was a useful topic. And now I got a couple of people thinking they will do it at Quintessence, because when you publish a book yourself, I know because I did it once, it's about $100,000. So I want to do it for them. So just follow me on social media, and when it starts to come out, I will for sure let everybody know. But I'd love to have you in a course too. So the composites called the Final Touch Composites and the Final Touch for Ceramics. Any more questions out there? Okay. I was in a lecture one time that the lecturers came back after lunch. It was 400 people, and he asked, are there any questions? 400, and I'm going, yeah. Could you repeat the part after good morning? Okay, because he didn't do such a good job. And then I did a lecture with Kenny Malamet. Some of you know that name, and Dan Nathanson, and know that name. And there was like 400 people in it in Boston too, and not a soul left. I mean, at the end of the lecture, not a soul left, and we were talking about all the science stuff. And we were patting ourselves on the back like we did a good job. And I was boring myself, to tell you the truth. And the minute they gave the CE number, I mean, the room emptied. We didn't get one question, so we probably didn't do that good a job. All right, let me scroll through this. There's a couple more coming up. James says, thank you. Thanks, James, for coming. So we got a couple more minutes here if anybody has any other questions. So again, the salient points were really important points were understand how your internal surface treatment. If you're going to bond, you do want to sandblast. If you're going to conventional cement, you want to use glass beads. That was number 1. Okay. Then number 2 is that I would for sure use a primer. Okay, to wet the surface if I was bonding. Okay. And then number 3, if you're having problems with your, let's say, translucency of zirconia, it's looking very marbly. 95%. The problem is the firing. The firing temperatures, the firing schedule, and maybe an oven that just won't do what it needs to do. Like a bad curing light, right? Remember the days where curing lights didn't put out any light, so the composite didn't cure. Same issues. All right, well, let's see. Did I miss any other questions? Let me scroll back through here on the questions list. Looks like I missed what you said about ideal cement for a 5Y. Okay, yes, Charles. So the question was, I missed what an ideal cement for a 5Y. If you use a primer, okay. So first of all, for a conventional cement, I'd use a regular resin reinforced glass ionomer, whichever one on the market you like. That's what I'd use for conventional cement. If you want to put a little bonding agent on the tooth, that's fine. That to me would be still defined as conventional cement, or a regular glass ionomer. Okay, as you know, several on the market over the years. Fuji, GC has one. You all know the product names. But if you want to bond, okay, so I'm going to sandblast for sure if I want to bond, whether it's a 4Y or a 5Y material. Then I'm going to use a primer, a zirconia primer, one specifically for zirconia. It looks like liquid water almost. Okay, those of you that have worked with it, you paint that on, all right? You evaporate the solvent. That you don't need to cure, okay, because that's pure chemistry to the zirconia. Then what I use is a regular dual cure that I have in a drawer. I could use something that is a is a all-in-one cement, a universal type cement if you have a universal dual cure. So either one of those will work fine, but I would still make sure that I did something to wet the surface of zirconia. All right. Let me see, we've got a couple more. Is internal staining, you mean on the okay, by internal staining. Okay, great. A couple more questions just shot through. By internal staining, you mean on the intaglio surface. Okay, zirconia is very porous until it's sintered. Okay, it's like chalk. Think of it like chalk for the dentist out there. You actually have the ability, the same colorants that might already be in the block that the manufacturer put in the block that you'll see after you cook it, okay? You can get the same colorants, and they have some intense colors, but they have more A2s, whatever color you want, okay? And then what you do is you paint the chalk, the shape of the crown, whatever color that you want. Now that's its own skill set, because you can't see what it's going to look like until you cook it. And I can add a little bit more chrome in the gingival third. I could add a little bit more fake translucency or a little pigment to create translucency that absorbs into the zirconia. And then when you fire it, you get a three-dimensional color effect. So that's what I meant by internal staining. Okay, then you can also, like you can with ceramics or composites or anything, you can put stain on the surface too. So there's two ways. And so typically, if I'm doing a front tooth or a bridge or something like that, I would do internal and external staining that'll give a much more three-dimensional effect. That's how I would do it. Okay, is there any way to compare multi-zirconia and spectrum like Ivoclar and multi-layer of Noritake that has three specific layers? Yeah, we did that. Okay, I could show you all that data too. Okay, so the Noritake is not multi-layer; it's multi-color. Okay, so the STML. Now the YML is all right. So all of them now have gradient colors, where there's more chrome in the gingival third and more or less chrome, let's say, in the incisal block. Okay, there's only two companies now that have a gradient of three different materials, a gradient of maybe 3Y, 4Y, and 5Y, or two materials, 4Y and 5Y, and it's Ivoclar and Noritake. But again, the reason for the Ivoclar, one, they were first on the market, and number two, it's very stable over large specimens firing. In other words, it doesn't warp. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why I would use it for bridges. All right, now I did test it, okay, for translucency. All right, the translucency, the color isn't all that different, okay, but the translucency is in the three different layers. So that's the benefit of using a gradient yttria material, is you get a little more opacity deeper in the crown, what you want, more like deep dentin, let's say. And in the middle, you get more like dentin translucencies, or the incisal, hopefully like enamel. Now, I didn't throw you all the enamel numbers in there. 1 millimeter of enamel is around 65% translucent. And what that 43% meant was 43% of the light went through out of 100% or 45%. So we're getting closer to enamel. To give you an idea of enamel porcelain, it's the same, almost roughly the same as real enamel. Okay, Empress is very close to enamel. Okay, that's one of the closer, or a Vita block is very close to enamel. So very good materials there. So that's why I choose them for the thinner veneer type restorations. Okay, the more glass-based restorations. So yes, I am, the answer to the rest of the question, I am comparing these materials in strength, okay? So that's part of a paper that we're working on. And I did show you some of that data so you can see. Do you need to light cure Z prime is a question? No, it's purely a molecule, an MDP molecule, okay? It reacts on both sides. It reacts with zirconia on one side, bonds to zirconia chemically, and on the other side, it bonds chemically to the composite. No, so it does not need to be cured. If you're using a universal, the universal has several components in it. It has a resin in it, okay? Plus it has the MDP primer. And then it has a couple of other things in there. My concern about those materials on the zirconia is the film thickness, okay? When we add the resin, we don't need the resin right away to the zirconia. We get that from our cement, okay? So that's why I like to use the Z prime plus or monobond plus or whatever all the pluses are today, okay? What material do you use for veneers? Okay, so veneers, the digital dental team, what I meant by that was it's the system, right? The CAD/CAM system, the material, the scanner, the dentist, plus the technician too, that does the finishing. If I'm purely in a monolithic digital space where I'm gonna machine and then finish and maybe paint without layering at all, today for me it's going to be one and two materials, and it's been a lot, mostly Empress Multi, and I don't like to be 100% into one camp. Okay, and that's a fabulous material. And obviously, Vita makes a pretty good material too. They've been at it for a long time. They call it Vita Trilux or Vita Block. So those would be the two materials that I would recommend there. Now, obviously, you can if you need a higher strength, maybe if you got a Bruxer, you're going to make Emax CAD. That's a great material too. We've all used that for what, 15 years, maybe 18 years or something like that, it seems like. The only downside to that is a little more opacious. It's a little bit more opacious than the Empress Multi. Also harder to grind on. And so the Empress Multis, what we tested, we were around 170, 180 megapascals. That's plenty for an anterior restoration, and we don't need to layer that at all. Okay, let's move on here. And how do you ideally clean the internal surface of a crown in between try-in and final cementation? Okay, great question. I should have answered that in there, all right? Well, you can get saliva off with some various certain things, okay? There's things like Ivoclean and stuff like that. The downside of that is that sometimes then you got to go to the ultrasonic and ultrasonic it for about 10 minutes, all right? So the fastest and best, and I can show you the numbers, ways to do it, is get an office steam cleaner. Just get a little small steam cleaner, go on eBay, okay, and plug in jewelry steam cleaner. Go on Amazon, plug in jewelry steam cleaner. They're about $300, $350. And you just steam clean the inside for 10 seconds. If you buy it from Dental, you pay $1,000, $1,500, $3,500, which they're better. But if you're just doing it occasionally, if it's not a laboratory and you just need one chair side or one in your little small lab space, that's what I would do. Last question, and I think they're trying to shut me down right here. Does sandblasting alter the internal stain result? No. Okay. No, because it's throughout the zirconia. Okay. Now, some people do actually put stain on the inside, but then you would sandblast it off. Okay. What keeps you loving what you do every day? Insanity. So there's a question here from Mike. What keeps you loving what you? I don't know. You just got to do something, right? Otherwise, I'll wither away and die, I suppose. Because I love this stuff. This is fun for me. Okay, and I like doing a little bit of everything. I do a little research. I do some lab work. And I like learning new stuff, and that's what keeps you alive. So. And I'm not a young chicken anymore. All right, this is the last question. What is the best essence or effect for this material microlayer? Okay, I'm not sure I understand. What's the best essence or effect for this internal to microlayer? Okay, if I was going to microlayer, I would use a 4Y material. Okay, I would use a 4Y material. Or I would use prime aesthetic. Okay, excuse me, regular prime. Okay, because I have the little stronger on the inside. All right. So that's what I would do. If I'm not going to layer, it'll be a 5Y or prime aesthetic material. All right, so I think that takes us right to the hour. They told me to stop at 1 hour. So guys, are you out there that are running me right now? Hello, hello, hello.
Thanks, Dr. McLaren.
Okay. All right, so I guess I'm signing off here. Hopefully that helped everybody here. By the way, I don't mind you guys if anybody wants. That's up to you. I sent them a PDF if anybody really wants it, or your normal processes, that's fine with me. Okay. Okay, so I guess I'm going to sign off right here. Bye, everybody. See you in cyberspace or in a meeting sometime in the future.